Having car problems? Well, with Rhoda, getting them fixed is as easy as ordering takeout. They'll come pick up your car for free, do any repair or maintenance needed, and return it right to your driveway. They'll even give you a complimentary video inspection of your car so you can see what needs to be done. Perfect for those of us that maybe aren't so car savvy. Book your appointment online at roda.com. And lucky for you, CityCast listeners get a 20% discount on any service for up to $100 off. Just use the code CityCast20.
Today on CityCast DC, it is local budget season here in DC. But please don't let your eyes glaze over quite yet. DC's mayor has actually proposed a bunch of cuts to fix a $700 million deficit. There's some serious stuff on the table. The mayor's budget director, Jenny Reed, is here to walk us through their proposal and how we got here. Today is Monday, May 13th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Jenny.
Hi, Michael.
You're the budget director, and it's your big season right now, for better or worse.
It is. It's our crunch time.
And so for the last, a couple of decades, people who have read about, followed news in DC or covered news in DC have been accustomed to budget season not being a kind of calamity, full of danger and threat, because the city has been rightly pretty proud of its fiscal management. Good rainy day funds. Obviously, it's required to balance the budget. This year is tougher. You and the administration are having to make some tough decisions in the face of what was a $700 million shortfall in 1 year and considerably more than that over multiple years. Why is it different now? What's happening?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have what I consider kind of the perfect storm of circumstances that are happening all at once. So the first item is that we are facing the expiration of a historic amount of federal stimulus funds. We and every other city and state across the country benefited greatly from a series of COVID-19 funding bills. The district got over $2.3 billion in flexible funds from the American Rescue Plan Act. But all of that money is set to expire. We use that money to make really good and important investments, but we don't have the local revenue to make up for that loss in federal funds. At the same time, we also have slower growth in revenues. So our revenues were growing at about 6% a year before the pandemic. They're now down to about 2% a year.
And that's a function of commercial real estate being in the doldrums nationally, and that's a big chunk of where we get our money.
That's right. Yeah, we're still feeling the impacts of remote work, right? And as we don't have many people coming into the office, we are not only seeing less activity downtown, but we are also just seeing lower commercial property values, which have been a really big share of DC's economy. And the last item is we are seeing just really significant cost increases in things that we have to do. So a great example is Metro. You guys may have talked about, I'm sure many people know about the huge fiscal cliff that Metro was facing. The mayor pledged over $200 million in new resources just to make sure Metro didn't have big service cuts or big fare increases. But also, all of our labor unions are up for renegotiation of their contracts. Utilities, leasing, electricity, everything is more expensive, right? Just like I'm sure everyone else is feeling. So you have these three things hitting at the same time: slower growth in revenues, loss of federal stimulus funds, and giant cost increases, all led to what you described, this $700 million budget gap for next year, or $4 billion over our financial plan.
One thing about the COVID emergency money, which is obviously like everyone in the country is running out of it, people knew that wasn't like forever money. Did we budget with that knowledge, or did people succumb to a kind of presentist sense that because the money's coming in now, it'll come in forever?
So it was a mix of both. So there were some programs that we funded that we knew we were going to continue. So for example, we funded increased investments in our Homeward DC program. That's our investments to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. We always put money in the out years of our financial plan to be able to cover those with local dollars once those federal funds expired. So we knew that was going to happen. But there were other programs that were meant to truly be one time. A good example are some of the business recovery grants that we put out early on in the pandemic to help businesses that just couldn't open, that did not have people coming in the door, be able to maintain themselves. And then we tried a lot of new programs to see, would they work? Would they not work? Or is there something we want to adopt long term? And so part of the tough choices that we had to make in this budget was really looking at which ones had good evidence and did we want to start to put local dollars behind.
I mean, the money had initially come from Uncle Sam and you decided it was working. And so we found it in our own base. But now you've got this $700 million. You got to balance the budget. And it's an interesting moment in any government because this is the budget. It makes some people's eyes glaze over, but it is where we decide how much money we want to raise and how much we want to spend. And that is sort of an articulation of our values as a society. You are balancing this budget with a lot of slashing and a little bit of new revenue. What was the thinking behind the mix? I mean, some people might have said, like, just raise a bunch of taxes and keep everything going. Other people might have said, raise no taxes.
Sure. So I think we took a balanced approach, right? So first and foremost, what we wanted to do was look at our own spending. So we wanted to look and see if we could find true savings. And we were able to find quite a bit, about $500 million of true savings.
Wait, what does true savings mean?
Yeah, exactly. I'll give you some examples. So we looked at our phone line usage and devices usage across the district. And one of the things we found that we had more than 10,000 devices and phone lines that hadn't been used in more than 6 months. Like nobody had actually turned them on. And so we asked agencies why. Now, there are some good reasons. So there might be agencies that have an emergency response function and they need some extra equipment in the event of a sort of major incident. So it makes sense that they wouldn't turn those on. Others just had devices that weren't being used. And so we worked with the agencies and we were able to turn off more than 8,800 of those devices, which we were paying monthly fees for service.
So you found $500 million of that kind of stuff?
We did.
To remind everyone what the size of the whole budget is.
I will. So the size of the whole budget is $21 billion. And what I will say is when I'm going to talk to you about a lot of these numbers, a really important factor, a really important point of the district's budget is we are actually required to balance over 4 years. There is no other jurisdiction in the country that I'm aware of that has to do a 4-year balanced budget and financial plan. Most places do 2, some do 1. So we are having to make decisions today based on conditions we think we will see in 4 years. And that's one of the big challenges here is if you look at our forecast across the financial plan, the resources, the revenue growth slows down as we get towards the out years. And that's because the CFO, the chief financial officer, is projecting a slowdown in the economy. We don't know if that's going to happen. We have to plan for it, but it also means we have to make cuts right now for something that may or may not occur. So $500 million across the plan in those types of items. Just to give you a few more examples, we look to maximize Medicaid reimbursements from the feds for anything that we do. We are able to have more services eligible for Medicaid funds. For example, case management services for permanent supportive housing, which is a service that we provide to our chronically homeless residents. We now can get that qualified for Medicaid reimbursement, which means for every dollar spent, we get 70 cents reimbursed from the federal government. So the more that we can build those services, the less we can take off our local dollars.
So this is like the budgeting equivalent of like cash in the couch.
Yeah, we also renegotiated leases. Then we did do about $500 million of program reductions.
Let me ask about some of them. I think the one that probably got the most attention when it was first rolled out was the cuts to this fund that's supposed to provide equity to childcare workers, which is to say, make them paid the same way that teachers are. That program's cut, a lot of money saved in that, but that's obviously a lot of pain. Nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, I want to go stick it to daycare workers. What was the thinking behind that cut?
That was a really tough choice to make, and one that we needed to make at the very end of our process after learning that we were going to be required to refill what's called a fiscal stabilization reserve that we had tapped last year as we were balancing the budget. We do not believe that We have to repay it in this upcoming budget because it's not required by law. However, our CFO, our independent CFO, thought differently, and we were concerned that we weren't going to be able to deliver a budget to the DC Council, who then could deliberate and vote so we could get everything ready for October 1, which is the start of our fiscal year. So we reluctantly made a cut to that program. We unfortunately had to eliminate it, and in order to submit a balanced budget to the council. And the way it's called the Pay Equity Fund, which is the fund we're talking about to pay for childcare workers. The way it was structured, it was not going to be sustainable even if we didn't fall on these hard times. So we've been talking a lot with people about tweaks that we can make so that when we create new programs or expand programs, they grow in such a way that matches the growth in our revenues.
So another place where there may be cuts despite a boost is in DCPS, right? You've changed the funding formula. It's like a 12% increase, but they still may need to lay off or eliminate a few hundred positions. Can you explain what's happening there?
Sure. So with the DC public schools, so as you mentioned, we did make a substantial increase. What we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic was that we added a lot more adults in our schools than was necessary for a growing population. So for example, we added 1,800 positions since 2019, adult positions in schools, while at the same time adding 1,600 kids. We needed to add some more adults in schools during the COVID period, right? We had a lot of isolation and quarantine. We had temperature checkers. We also just needed more supports. A lot of those positions were paid for with federal, what they call ESSER money. So this is specific money from the federal government through the COVID-19 pandemic stimulus bills, specifically to make sure schools had additional resources.
That stuff we knew was always going to go away.
We knew it was going to go away. It was more than $660 million to our school system, and it provided tremendous benefits. So we have been able to provide an increase in local funds to keep some of that increased staffing, but we aren't able to make up for the entire gap with all of the expiration of federal funding sources.
Sign up to The Economist for in-depth curated expert analysis of world events and topics ranging from business and culture to science and technology. You'll get the weekly digital edition, online-only articles, curated newsletters on politics, the markets, science, culture, and China, and full access to The Economist Podcast Plus. The Economist is independent journalism for independent thinking. Go to economist.com and get your first month free.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
So on the other side of the ledger, you proposed a couple of tax hikes to bring in more money. What was the ratio of new revenue from the proposed taxes to cuts?
Sure. So as I mentioned, it was a balanced approach, right? So it was about 50-50. And the first thing we did was we looked for areas we could find efficiencies or we could make program reductions. That got us a good part of the way. It allowed us to kind of fund what we were currently doing, but it didn't let us get all the way in some of our must-fund items like the schools that we talked about. It also didn't let us make new investments in areas that we felt were important to prioritize the district's comeback. So that's public safety, public education, and the downtown. So we looked at what were ways that we could have a shared sacrifice and everyone could contribute to solving this budget gap. So we did, I think, sort of 3 big revenue raisers. So one is we are asking our visitors to contribute by paying a modest 80-cent per room per night fee on their hotel stay. All of that money is going to go directly into our 911 system. We have one of the busiest 911 call centers in the country. And so we need to make sure that we can adequately staff that center and adequately fund the technology needs. The second is around our businesses. So we made adjustments to the paid family leave tax, brought it back to what it was just a couple of years ago to allow us to bring in additional revenue to support those critical investments. And then lastly, we will implement a modest increase in our sales tax starting 2 years from now if we need it. So I think one of the important things to mention is we start that tax increase in the later years, but we don't actually think we're going to need to do it. And the reason for that is we believe that the investments that we're making right now are going to change the trajectory of our revenue growth. And so we believe that our economy is going to continue its comeback, and we're going to have the additional revenues we need to invest in our critical programs and services without having to rely on all of the tax increases.
Of all the tax increases, I get why any city wants to put money at hotels and stuff like that, because the people who do the paying are not the people who do the voting. But with something like a sales tax, that's this regressive tax, tends to fall more heavily on people with less money. Why do it with sales tax and not with something that can be more progressive?
So, one thing I think that's important to note is the district does have one of the most progressive income tax systems already in the country. And we're really, really proud of that. The second is the sales tax isn't just paid by residents. It's paid by visitors, and it's paid by workers who come in from Maryland and Virginia, use our roads, use our bridges, but don't contribute. The second is broader based, right? And it's important to note that here in the District of Columbia, we don't put sales tax on essentials, right? So we don't put sales tax on groceries. We don't put sales tax on medicine. But if you weren't going to have a tax that's broader based, then you really have to go much deeper on a smaller share of the population. And with the gaps that we were looking to close, we just did not believe the only other two places you really could have gone were residential real property and individual income. And the amounts that you would have had to increase either of those to reach the same scale, we thought would have been too much.
The fun part, I guess, from your point of view, is there's places where you put some chips on the board, decided we're going to invest in some stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Downtown, public safety. Tell me about those decisions. Why those things?
Sure. So first and foremost, I'll talk about public safety, right? We know it's something it still is on everyone's mind. We're really happy that crime rates are going down, but we know we can't take our foot off the gas. And so we needed to make investments in a couple areas. I already mentioned our 911 call center. We are one of the busiest call centers in the country. We had to add more call takers and dispatchers so that we can answer the phone in a timely fashion and get you the help that you need. We also needed to make sure that we continue our investments in the Metropolitan Police Department. And we're excited that with this budget, we're going to see the first net increase in sworn officers in 5 years. We also, though, added positions at MPD that will contribute to public safety, but aren't necessarily what most folks consider law enforcement. So we added 40 community safety ambassadors that can do two functions. They can help you out and be a government presence in the community to help residents. They can also handle duties that we don't necessarily need a sworn officer to handle. We also are making a big investment in our youth. And so we know we have a problem with truancy in the district. And so we're investing $7 million in our Department of Human Services to provide more outreach and support to our youth and our families when we're seeing that they're chronically truant. We're also making investments in pop-up retail activations, in converting office buildings from just vacant office space into something more used both day and night. So it could be hotels, it could be residential, it can be any kind of use. And then, of course, we have our notable investment in our Capital One arena facility that will allow us to modernize that facility and keep the Wizards and Capitals right here in the district.
So one of the things, the knocks that got thrown your way when you and the mayor testified was, if you look at where the cuts are, right? There's the Housing Production Trust Fund, access to justice, the equity for daycare teachers, and you look at the places where the investments are, downtown, the arena, et cetera. The criticism is this budget is being balanced on the backs of the neediest, the most vulnerable. What'd you guys say in response to that?
Well, I don't think that's the case. And here's why. So if you take a look at how we allocate our resources, we spend prior to this year and in this year's upcoming budget, we continue to spend more than half of our resources on human services and education. It is where the largest share of our funding goes. It's 53%. That was true last year, true the year before, and it's true now. We also, if you look at our capital budget, and it's important to note, the capital budget is where we're funding the arena. So the capital budget is what we use to build infrastructure around the city. We build libraries, we build schools, we maintain roads. That's the money that we're putting into the Capital One arena. Our entire 6-year CIP is $11.8 billion. $500 million of that $11.8 billion is going to the Capital One arena. Everything else is for schools, libraries, transportation, parks and recreation, all of the things that all of our residents use. And then on the operating side, which is where we fund like teacher salaries and summer camps and things like that, we continue to make significant investments. Our top 10 largest agencies include the public schools, include our Department of Healthcare Finance that does Medicaid, our Department of Human Services, our Department of Behavioral Health, our Metropolitan Police Department, our Fire Department, our debt service, WMATA. So just from a purely mathematical standpoint, if you want to close a budget gap, you have to touch some of those areas. It's just, you would otherwise completely decimate whole agencies in government. And there's still things that we have to do, right? We still have to pick up the trash. We still have to answer the phone when you call 911, right? And so we have to make sure if we had put all the cuts on those types of services, they just would have been completely decimated. The good news is we still do a lot in the district, especially in the area of human services and education, which is why it is the largest share of our budget.
So you mentioned Glenn Lee, the chief financial officer, a minute ago, and I just wanted to go back to that. If you were the budget director for a normal city or state, the executive branch would propose a budget, the legislative branch would have their own budget, everybody would knock heads for a while, and then the result would be the result, and that would be that. In DC, there's this other step, which is there's this quasi-independent office whose occupant has to certify the city budget. And this year, the beginning of the process, he said, wait a minute, there's this reserve fund that needs to be filled, and that is going to cost you guys an extra couple $100 million. The Bowser administration said, we don't agree with that, but we're just going to do it because having the budget not certified would be pretty bad. There's members of the council who've said, this is nonsense. We're not going to heed that, and we'll see you in court or some version thereof. Explain to me, one, why did you guys disagree with Glenn Lee's stance? And two, why don't you take the same stance as the council members on this?
So just a quick background. So what we're talking about is the Fiscal Stabilization Reserve. It's one of 4 reserves we have in the district. 2 are federally mandated, our emergency and our contingency reserve. And then 2 are created under local law, the cash flow reserve and the fiscal stabilization reserve. Fiscal stabilization is meant to tap into when you're having tougher economic times, right? It's meant to be a bridge while you wait for your revenues to recover. When we started this budget process, we had every intention of paying it back, and we were planning on it. However, when we started looking at the types of cuts we needed to make, we paused and said, wait, it doesn't quite make sense to do this right now. We have time to replenish it. We have a process to replenish it. Let's follow that. There is no legal requirement to replenish the fund in any given time period. There's just not. Secondly, we have a mechanism for repaying it. At the end of the fiscal year, any money that's left over goes in to fill our reserves. And that's how we filled it in the first place. So we said, let's go to that. It wasn't until we were closer to the end of the process that the CFO said, no, I really need you to fill it now. And I need you to fill it now because I might have a cash flow issue in FY 2028. Well, that's 4 years from now. If we have a problem then, let's certainly address it. We could even take steps to start to plan for it now. But why are we making such significant cuts right now when it's a problem that isn't going to happen for 4 years? And then the last thing I'll say is, since it's not required under law the CFO has every right and frankly duty to advise the mayor and council on what they believe is the most prudent path. But it's up to the elected officials to make the ultimate choice.
Why not follow the lead of members of the council who have said just blow the guy off?
I mean, he is our CFO. We don't take what he says lightly, but we also were in the midst of this conversation, which is going to take a little bit of time to unpack. And the consequence would have been not giving the council a budget to deliberate and potentially not having a budget by the time the fiscal year starts, which is not a place that we are going to put district residents and businesses in. We continue to have discussions with the CFO and with the council. I'm sure you saw that the mayor and the chairman had a joint letter to the Office of the Attorney General asking for their opinion on what was within the CFO's parameters or not. He came back with an opinion saying the CFO did not have the ability to mandate the reserve to be filled. And so we continue to work with the council, and we believe that the council is the one that should be able to make the decision at the end of the day.
So this year's been, rough. It's been a time when you've had to make choices. How confident do you feel that we're not going to be back in another spot next year, or the year after, making the budget where you're going to have to be, again, identifying either things to cut or revenue to raise? So do you think that the budget you've just made anticipates a city that's going to grow at that rate and without having to make new cuts?
I think that our economic trajectory is going to improve, right? Our forecasts are updated on a quarterly basis, and except in times of recession or during the COVID-19 pandemic, our situation has continued to improve. Our numbers are improving across the board, right? Tourism's recovering, population's recovering, student enrollment is recovering. All of our signs of recovery are going up. The big concern, as we talked about, is the commercial office market, right? And so we have a lot of strategies in place through this budget that attempts to make sure that we have other areas of economic growth so that we're not so reliant on the commercial office sector.
But one of the things I think I heard you saying was that these investments you're making in downtown and law enforcement will themselves cause the economic outlook, and therefore the amount of money the city gets to take in, will cause those things to improve, and again make it less likely that we wind up in the same place in a year.
That's right. But I will say, though, at the same time, like every year we look at what we should cut, right? Because every year we need to take stock of how are we doing? How are the programs working? Are they being effective? Are they being efficient use of taxpayer dollars? So we're always going to look at what should we keep doing? What should we do more of? And what should we stop? So that's never going to end. What I do worry about is, based on what we've seen so far with the council and what they are doing with the mayor's budget in terms of their markups, they're not accepting most of the cuts. So they're finding other revenues to increase, or they're finding, really, frankly, core services to cut into to fund things that we may not be able to maintain going forward.
What are some of the things you see as core services that they want to cut into?
Well, one of the things that we saw in a committee markup was cutting security services for our Department of General Services. These are the people that provide security to all our government facilities. Unfortunately, security costs are going up. We have more facilities opening. And we've had some, unfortunate public safety incidents at our facilities that require a higher level of response. If we need to cut back, that means less presence. It means going from armed to unarmed presence, or it means not having presence at all or only during certain hours, right? Those are things that we have to do. And those are things that we shouldn't be cutting to fund programs that may not be sustainable. You talked about access to justice. One of the things that we found very frustrating is the entire increase in access to justice funding was funded with federal ARPA funds and one-time funding. It's not sustainable. And we warned people that it wasn't sustainable.
Meaning they were funding it like it's a permanent program, but the money they were using to fund it was like, guys, this money's only for a year. Yeah.
Right. And so when things like that happen, they are very hard to maintain going forward. And so we've been warning and pushing folks not to rely on this one-time funding, because while the district has experienced, robust revenue growth and big surpluses in prior years, we're not seeing it anymore.
So you look at budget every year, good years, bad years, see what things are maybe not the best places to spend. Does that mean that like when you walk around government buildings, people like try to look extra busy when they see Jenny coming?
Well, I would say it's twofold. I think that you're always better off letting your budget team know exactly how things are working and why they're working, right? Because we need to understand why your costs are changing. But I would also say that, part of my work is my office is the Office of Budget and Performance Management, right? So we do the budget, but we also look at the effectiveness of programs. And we try to work with agencies to improve the effectiveness of their programs. So we need to make sure that, we need to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. So we need to understand that dollars are being used efficiently, but we also need to be good stewards to our residents and try to ensure the programs that are meant to help them are actually doing what they say they're going to do, right? And that's a lot of the work that we do, is trying to understand, are there ways we can deliver services faster, more effectively, more easily? And we do that all throughout the year.
Jenny, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
That is all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.